Have you ever looked at the instrument section in Ableton Live's browser and been left just a little bit confused and overwhelmed by what you're looking at? Or maybe you've checked out the different editions of Ableton Live and the different instruments that come with those different editions, but you're not sure which edition to buy based on those instruments. Or maybe you've been using Live for a while and you just don't really understand the difference between one instrument over another. Well, in this video, I'm going to be going through each of the different instruments in all the editions of Ableton Live to get you to grips with how they work, what they do, and what sets them apart from one another. Hey, I'm Matt Tinkler, Ableton certified trainer and founder of Aspect Music Academy, where we help electronic music makers like yourself break down technical barriers so that you can achieve creative independence. So we're actually going to go through the different instruments based on some kind of categories that they fall into, and we're going to start with the samplers. So first off, what is a sampler? A sampler is basically an instrument that takes in a MIDI signal and generates some kind of sound based on an existing audio recording or a sample. There are four main types of samplers in Ableton Live. The first one is Simpler. If we just grab Simpler from the browser and drag it onto a MIDI track, we can see it looks like this, and it doesn't really make any sound if we send it any MIDI until we drop a sample in it where it says drop sample here. For the sake of demonstration, let's drag a snare sample into this Simpler, and now we get the ability to play back this snare sample at different pitches based on an incoming MIDI note being sent into the instrument. Simpler offers us a bunch of features to control things like the envelope, increasing the attack, the sustain, and decay, playing the sample back in one-shot mode, which means it plays the whole length of the sample, or even slicing the sample to play back different parts of it. For example, like we've done here with this vocal sample, where the different MIDI notes are now triggering different slices of the sample rather than repitching it. Simpler is a fantastic sampler for taking a single sample and getting enough features that you can turn it into a relatively complex and fully functional instrument. It's also worth noting that Simpler is available in every edition of Ableton Live, including Live Lite, so no matter what edition you have, you can use Simpler. Next up, another sampler that's available in every edition of Ableton Live, which is Drum Sampler. Now, Drum Sampler is very, very similar to Simpler, except it just has a few different features in terms of the interface. There's a little bit less functionality in terms of the controls that we have to manipulate the sample, but it also has this really cool effects engine in the middle, which allows us to apply some interesting effects to the sample. For instance, here we've got a kick drum sample loaded up into the drum sampler. We can change things like its envelope, length, filter, and then the effects section gives us a variety of controls that we can use to kind of adjust the way in which this sample is played back, or any kind of audio effects that are added to it. We can only use one of these effects at a given time, but we've got things like stretch, loop, some more interesting things like FM, ring mod, and noise. If you want to understand the differences between Drum Sampler and Simpler in more detail, I do have a video which you can check out with the card above, but Drum Sampler is basically just a much simpler version of Simpler, and as the name suggests, it's much more useful for single-shot drum samples like kick drums or snare drums, but the simplicity of its interface and the unique effects section make it a nice, playable, and simple sampler instrument. Next, we have an instrument that's only available in the Suite edition of Ableton Live, and that is Sampler. You can think of Sampler as just a lot of different instances of Simpler all stacked on top of one another. We have the ability to load up a bunch of different single samples or audio files inside of Sampler to create deep, multi-sampled instruments that can be like realistic representations of real instruments. If we take a look at this sampler instrument here, this piano one, if I start to play some notes, it just sounds like a piano. But if I open up this zone editor, we can see all of the individual samples that actually make up this piano sound, and there are a lot of them. So basically, each of the individual MIDI notes that I'm sending into this sampler are all triggering a different recording of the same piano playing a different note. So it sounds like a cohesive and natural instrument, as opposed to something that's just repitching a single sample, which can sometimes sound a little bit unnatural. Sampler also offers some great modulation capabilities and some interesting sound design opportunities in the pitch and oscillator section and the filter global section as well, where we can add in a filter. Sampler is much more useful for specialized multi-sample instrument creation or some interesting sound design possibilities that you're not otherwise able to get in something like Simpler or Drum Sampler. If you are interested in a deeper overview of the differences between Simpler and Sampler, I do have another video which you can check out with the card above that goes through those exact differences. Our last sample-based instrument is Impulse. Impulse is kind of designed to be an 8-sample playback drum machine, so by default we don't have any samples loaded up. Let's go and load some samples into here. And now with samples loaded into each of these slots, we can play back the sample with the play button or by setting the corresponding MIDI note. And then each of the samples gets some independent controls such as the start position and transposition, some stretching, similar to drum sampler, some filter and drive controls, which you can activate in the center. And then there's a few global controls that affect everything, for instance, the volume, time, and transpose. Impulse is available in every single edition of Ableton Live, but honestly is pretty limited in the way that you get to interact with the samples you've loaded into it. You only get the ability to load up 8 samples, which is different to something like Drum Rack, which we'll talk about later, and the interface makes it a little bit hard to understand what's going on with those individual samples. I recommend using something like Drum Rack in conjunction with Simpler or Drum Sampler instead of using something like Impulse. So that's all of the different samplers that are available inside of Ableton Live. Next up, the next biggest category is the synthesizer category. So what is a synthesizer? Basically, it's an instrument that takes in an incoming MIDI signal or MIDI note and then generates a sound based on that incoming MIDI signal. Unlike a sampler, it doesn't use an existing audio file to generate the sound. Instead, it actually generates a sound from scratch using the code that programs that specific synthesizer, in the case of something like Ableton Live. The first and only synth that's available inside of every edition of Ableton Live is Drift. Now, I've spoken a lot about Drift on this channel, and I think it's a fantastic synthesizer, especially when it comes to learning synthesis. It's very user-friendly. Everything is accessible basically from the single interface that you see in front of you. It's got a lot of versatility built into its different sections, for example, like FM. But where Drift really excels is kind of more vintage, warm, analog style sounds, which comes from its namesake drift parameter, which basically adds in some slight error or variation to every single new note that passes through it. You can use it for everything like basic synth sounds or nice kind of pad sounds. Or cool, crunchy bass and lead sounds. It's super simple, easy to use, beginner friendly, and has a great variety of sonic options. Because of this and the fact it's available in every edition of Ableton Live, I recommend it to a lot of beginners who are starting out their synthesis journey. And it's also what I've used to build up a lot of different presets and instruments for myself because I think it sounds good, and you can get some of those instruments and presets available on my website under the Simple Bundle. The next synthesizer that we're going to talk about is available in both standard and suite editions of Ableton Live, and it is Analog. Analog is more complex than Drift and is much older. It's kind of a little bit more clunky to work with, and its interface is a little bit harder to understand what's going on. But it falls into the same kind of category in that it's really designed to create those old vintage, warm, analog style synthesizer sounds. It's got 2 oscillators, 2 filters, 2 amplifiers, and a noise engine. And a lot of flexible routing capabilities when it comes to putting things like the oscillators between the different filters out to the different amplifiers, all available in the global section with a few different quick routing options, as well as some routing options underneath each of the oscillators themselves. There's a nice unison. But because of its interface, it's a little bit more confusing in terms of understanding how each of the sections interact with one another and how you can actually kind of send audio between the different sections. That said, it's a really fantastic, capable synthesizer, and again, really good at things like pads. And bass and lead sounds with that more kind of vintage, warm, analog tone. Obviously, it's only available in standard and higher, but it's a great instrument to use if you're after a bit more complexity than something like Drift, but still want to stick in that more analog style of sound. Next, we're getting into the synthesizers that are only available in Ableton Live Suite, starting out with everyone's favorite, Operator. Operator is an incredibly powerful FM synthesizer or frequency modulation synthesizer. And basically what that means is that instead of each of the different oscillators or the sound sources being fed out individually, generally speaking, they're used to modulate the frequency or pitch of one another, resulting in some very interesting tones and timbres. Very metallic and potentially quite digital and artifacty sounding. Operator is fantastic for these kinds of sounds, things like bells, or some really gnarly digital sounding distorted bass sounds. or like wild, evolving FM textural sounds. It's also got a lot of flexibility in its routing options available in the global section, so you don't have to have every single oscillator doing frequency modulation, and there's a lot of modulation capabilities, great filtering, envelopes, etc. It's a super powerful synthesizer. So if you're starting to get a little bit more confident with synthesis, I highly recommend diving into something like Operator and starting to get to grips with how it works, because it will allow you to create some really super complex and awesome tones that you might find really difficult to get from other synthesizers in Ableton Live. Next up, we have Wavetable, which is another synthesizer that's only available in Ableton Live Suite, and it is Ableton Live's Wavetable synthesizer. So what is a Wavetable synthesizer? Well, basically it's very similar to things like drift and analog, which we've talked about before, where we get to choose a waveform and then it passes through something like a filter. But instead of the waveform of the initial oscillator being static, it's a morphable waveform, which gives us a lot of capabilities and possibilities when it comes to the modulation and the kind of evolving aspect of the sound. So if I start playing just a default wavetable here, over on the left, we have our oscillator, and we can see this wavetable position control that allows us to morph between different wave shapes in the same wavetable. And where wavetable synthesizers are really powerful is that we often have some very strange and interesting wavetables, which inside of Wavetable we can access under the category and then choose whatever particular wavetable we want. So you get access to some really interesting timbres and tones without actually having to do much to the synthesizer at all. There's a lot of modulation capabilities as well in terms of a few different envelopes, some LFOs, and a very user-friendly matrix. And it even has an expanded view, which gives us an overview of the oscillators, the modulators, and the matrix and the filter all at once. So you can really easily see what's going on and get really into the sound design process. Wavetable's fantastic, again, for things like evolving pad sounds. Or even some of those more analog style sounds as well. Awesome, very gnarly and cool bass sounds too. Of course, Wavetable is only available in Ableton Live Suite, but it is Ableton's answer to things like Serum and Vital, and it is really good at what it does. Our last instrument in the synthesizer category is another synthesizer that only comes in Ableton Live Suite, and that is Meld. Meld is a unique bitimbral macro-based synthesizer, and what does that mean? Well, basically, instead of it being a traditional synthesizer where we kind of choose an oscillator and there's very clear like signal flow, etc., and the ways in which that oscillator makes sound, Meld is made up of two different independent engines or sound sources, each of which can be a selection of kind of more unique sounds and ways of generating sound. For instance, let's turn off oscillator B and just focus on oscillator A. We can select any of these different kind of engine types from the drop-down menu, and then each of the engines have these two macro controls, which just adjust certain parameters of that engine based on what the engine is. And you can have kind of more traditional sounds like we've shown here, or even some very interesting things like this crackle, rain, bubble, etc. So you're not just limited to kind of more tonal synth sounds, there's a lot more textural options available to you inside of Meld. There's a relatively large modulation engine as well, with each of these two different sound engines, A and B, having their own envelopes and LFOs. The envelopes can be linked across both A and B, and we can access the entire modulation matrix with the expanded view. Each of the sound engines has their own independent filter. And as of recording this video in October of 2025, Meld is also the only synthesizer that has access to Ableton Live's scale awareness feature, which can lock its different sound engines and even the filters to the scale of the currently playing clip. If you're interested in kind of some unique sound design possibilities, maybe some unique textural sounds, and you want to just experiment with sound design rather than getting caught in the weeds, Meld is a really fantastic instrument for that. It's a little bit hard to get more traditional sounds out of Meld, but it is very fun and flexible when it comes to just sitting down for a sound design session. So that is all of the main synthesizers inside of Ableton Live. Next up, I want to dive into a little bit more of a different category, which is the racks, of which there are 2 available in all editions of Ableton Live. Now, these racks aren't so much instruments in themselves as they are containers for containing different instruments. The first one is Drum Rack. Drum Rack gives us the ability to effectively play a different instrument with every single incoming MIDI note, and it's very useful for building things like drum kits, where we want different notes to trigger different samples or sounds. Say for instance, I had this drum rack and I wanted to add a kick drum to C1 here. I could just find a kick drum, click and drag it onto the pad, and it will add it as a simpler onto that pad. And now the C1 note being fed into this drum rack is always going to trigger this kick drum. If I wanted another kick drum on a different pad, now I have 2 different notes, C1 and C#1, triggering 2 different sounds in this drum rack. Drum rack also goes a lot deeper than that, and I have a few videos on drum rack on my channel, which you're welcome to check out. I'll leave a link in the card above or in the description below. But drum rack is highly useful for all of your drum programming needs and a lot more flexible than something like Impulse, because we have access to 127 or 128 different slots here, all of which can be used to store individual drum samples or even synthesizer sounds as well. Our next type of rack is instrument rack, which again acts very similarly to drum rack in that it's a container for different instruments. But this time, instead of splitting these different instruments by different notes, instrument rack allows us to kind of combine multiple instruments to create a layered, more complex sound. For instance, I could find a preset, drag it into the instrument rack, and if I open up the chain list, I could then find another preset, click and drag that into this instrument rack in the chain list area as well, and now I can play both of those instruments at the same time with a single MIDI note. We can also use an instrument rack to kind of store effects with our instruments as well. So I could add on some effects like maybe a delay and a reverb, and now those effects are only affecting that particular instrument, and we can turn on or off everything in the instrument rack itself with the instrument rack controls. Instrument and drum racks are also really useful for their ability to have macro controls, which basically allow us to have controls that can be assigned to any of the parameters across any of the different chains inside of that rack to kind of create some really flexible presets. For example, this analog bass that's already inside this instrument rack has a few macros assigned, which are controlling different parameters of the instrument that is inside it. If you want to learn more about drum rack, instrument rack, and audio effect and MIDI racks, I actually have a whole online course called Ableton Rack Mastery, which you can check out with the link in the description. But really, drum rack and instrument rack are just there as containers for containing multiple instruments and effects inside of them to create kind of layered and more complex instruments that are otherwise basically impossible to create with just a single synthesizer or sampler. The next category of instruments in Ableton Live is the physical modeling category. Now, these instruments, of which there are 3, are available in both the standard and suite editions of Ableton Live, and they're basically designed to mimic the physical characteristics of real-world instruments so that we can get a more kind of realistic sound generated from scratch rather than using samples. The first of these physical modeling synthesizers is Electric, which is designed to model an electric piano. Now, physical modeling instruments are kind of interesting because instead of having typical controls like oscillators, filters, etc., we get controls that are more aligned with what the actual physical characteristics of that instrument would be. For instance, we get to control the stiffness and the noise of the hammer with Electric, or the tine and tone of the fork. And these controls are adjusting things in the back end, in the code of the instrument, that are emulating actually changing these physical characteristics of that instrument. So Electric is really useful for things like, you guessed it, electric piano sounds like a whirly sound. The next physical modeling synthesizer is Collision, which is basically designed to emulate or simulate percussion sounds. By which I mean more tuned percussion, I suppose, rather than untuned percussion. You can see here the interface, we get control over things like the volume of the mallet, the stiffness and noise of it. We actually get to add some noise in here if we want to too. And then we get to control the resonator, of which there are a few different ones to choose from. We're currently on beam at the moment. We could do something like a marimba, or maybe even like a tube, which changes the characteristic quite drastically. With Collision, we can actually stack two of these different resonators together, and we can have one running into the other. For instance, I could have a resonator 1 running into resonator 2, which is how it is typically. Or I could add them together over the structure here. So we now have a tube and a string being hit by a mallet with some noise, and we can adjust things like the tuning, the brightness, and the characteristics of these different resonators to try and get a sound that mimics a real-world instrument or is something completely different entirely. Collision is fantastic again for things like bell sounds or marimba sounds or any of those kind of tuned percussion sounds. Then lastly, we have Tension, which is designed to mimic string instruments. By default, it kind of sounds like a guitar being plucked, but we could also make it something like a violin being bowed, for instance. I personally find Tension really hard to work with. It's quite a finicky instrument in that its controls very much interact with one another in very sensitive ways, but it is possible to get some relatively nice and somewhat realistic sounds coming out of Tension. For example, we do have this electric nylon guitar preset, which has things like the termination sound of the strings, and you get that nice plucky characteristic from the initial hit. And there's a bunch of controls, obviously, that we can change that all affect how this instrument sounds as well. And they're all, of course, named accordingly to the actual physical characteristics or the physical elements of the instrument that they're emulating. So all of these different physical modeling synthesizers, Electric, Collision, and Tension, come in the standard and suite editions of Ableton Live, and you can use all of them to create somewhat realistic representations of actual real-world instruments, or you could actually misuse them to create some very interesting tones and timbres. Last but not least, there are also a selection of instruments that come default with different editions of Ableton Live that are all created with what's called Maps for Live, which is basically a programming environment that allows you to create custom devices and edit custom devices for use inside of Ableton Live specifically. These instruments act basically exactly the same as all the other instruments that we've talked about so far, except for the key feature that if you really want to, you can open them up inside of the Max for Live programming environment, edit them, copy them, add them to your own devices, etc. There's a lot of possibilities when it comes to that. But let's dive through a few of the ones that come stock in Ableton Live different editions. First up, in both the standard and suite editions of Ableton Live, we actually get access to a selection of drum synthesizers, these DS instruments: DS clang, claps, cymbal, FM, HH, hi-hat, kick, snare, and tom. So I've pulled all of these into a drum rack here so that we can take a listen to them. And these are a selection of very simple synthesizers designed to emulate or mimic the sound of typical old school kind of electronic drum machines. Each of them offer us some very limited and select controls. For example, the kick drum. We get things like the decay, envelope, volume, and pitch. Then some drive and adding some click and stuff like that too, to really shape the tone of the kick drum. And the user interface of all of them is very similar as well. These instruments are great for those classic drum machine style sounds, especially when you want a little bit of tweakability in terms of adjusting things like the pitch, decay, envelope, and even some of the other tonal characteristics of these sounds as well. Next up, we have Bass, which is a monophonic synthesizer, again, designed inside the Max for Live environment, that's designed to kind of emulate old school analog monosynths. We get kind of a typical oscillator mixer here. with some very basic controls over each of these oscillators. We have a filter circuit, some interesting distortion, and our typical envelopes and stuff as well. Bass is actually really good at these kind of monophonic analog style bass sounds, somewhat unsurprisingly, and it's actually a really fun instrument to play around with, and also potentially a good instrument for learning some of the fundamentals of synthesis as well, particularly when it comes to kind of blending multiple oscillators together. Next we have Poli, which is designed to emulate a polyphonic analog synthesizer, meaning that we can play more than one note at once. And we have some nice controls here, things like a chorus, a nice filter, and again, our basic kind of oscillator mixer. We also have this nice kind of modulation matrix in the middle, very easily accessible, and access to your typical envelope, LFO, and some global controls as well, things like unison too. It's worth noting that both Bass and Poli are only available in the Suite editions of Ableton Live, and so is the next Max for Live instrument that we're going to talk about, which is Granulator III, which is a very, very cool instrument. So Granulator 3 actually falls back into the category of sampler, and it's designed to play back a sample in an interesting way that we call granular synthesis. I'm not really going to dive into depths in how to use Granulator 3 here, but in this example, we have a sample loaded up inside Granulator 3, and it's playing it back by splitting it into these grains, which is giving it this interesting textural sound. We can kind of see the playback positions of those grains there, and we get access to control a bunch of different things like the position, the scanning, the grain size. And Granulator 3 is really good at these kind of more textural and evolving sounds as well. Again, only available in Ableton Live Suite, also a Max for Live device, so you can kind of edit it if you'd like, but it is a really powerful sample-based synthesizer and really Ableton Live's only granular synthesizer. So that is every single instrument inside of Ableton Live. Let's just take a quick look at a little recap. Inside of the Lite edition of Ableton Live, we have access to Simpler, Drum Sampler, Impulse, Drift, Drum Rack, and Instrument Rack, and that also includes the Intro edition as well. And then inside of Standard, we add access to Analog and the 3 physical modeling synthesizers, including Electric, Collision, and Tension, as well as access to all of the different DS or Drum Synth instruments that are created inside of Max for Live. Lastly, Suite gives us access to Sampler, Operator, Wavetable, and Meld, as well as Bass and Poli, the 2 Max for Live instruments, and that Granulator 3 instrument, which is also created using Max for Live. But remember, whilst it's important to understand the tools, understanding the actual frameworks and fundamental principles behind how the tools works is really the true key to getting and achieving that creative independence, which allows you to actually utilize any of these instruments at all because you understand how they work on a fundamental level. And these are exactly the kind of principles that I teach in my 24-week mentorship program as part of Aspect Music Academy. The next intake opens in early 2026, and you can check out the link in the description for more information and to join the waitlist. That said, thank you so much for watching. Click the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, and make sure to comment down below and let me know which your favorite instrument is inside of Ableton Live. Otherwise, stay awesome, and I'll see you all in the next video.